It's the second time out for Scotland's the problem, and Chris Duncan as well. It's the second time out for Red Fox, Yanal Ashmouz. And listen, Yanal Ashmouz ran so Chris Duncan could walk. And the last time that these two guys fought, their respective UFC debuts were at UFC 286. Ashmouz knocks out Sam Patterson. And then Chris Duncan has a terrible fight against Omar Morales as the follow-up. It was the next fight. Matt, we had a lot to say about Yanal Ashmouz before his UFC debut, taking on Sam Patterson, because we didn't know what to think about him, and we weren't all that positive on him. So let's throw it on over to a clip before that Ashmouz debut. When you look at it for Yanal Ashmouz, and it's spelled A-S-H-M-O-Z by the UFC and Topology and SureDog, but on Yanal's own Instagram page, and the way that PFL spelled it, there's a U in his last name. So my apologies if that ends up getting changed throughout the week. And yes, we know his first name, what it rhymes with. Flannel. It's Yanal. But if you look at it for Yanal Ashmouz, I mean, the guy's 6-0, and he's put on some really impressive performances. And if you consider it, the last three fights are with more major organizations. Third to last fight with Ring of Combat, he takes on Armando Getasia. His last time out, he was taking on Dennis Hughes over with the PFL, and before that, took on Ryan Rizko over at CFFC. I've seen Yanal look, labored in some of these fights, but he always wins. I've seen him throw wild looping hooks, because that's going to be the big kind of story of this week. Yanal's billed as 5'9", and Sam Patterson's 6'3".
He's huge.
But Yanal almost looks smaller than that, so I'm really eager to see what we get out of these two guys, because Yanal's forearms, he looks like Dan Ugla for the fish.
Shout out.
The Florida Marlins, or I guess, his time that he spent with the Atlanta Braves.
Braves, yeah, that's who I think of.
But when you look at both of these guys, Matt, Yanal's so good at kind of closing distance, throwing those wild shots, and then landing head kicks. His hips must be so darn flexible. I think this is going to be a fight that not a lot of people focus on, but for two hungry guys making their respective UFC debuts, it could be a lot of fun.
It should be a really fun fight, but my problem is the way that Yanal fights is going to open up a lot of the grappling for a guy like Patterson.
We'll see in this matchup against Ashmouz, because he trains at a K-Warrior Dojo Tribe, or K-Dojo Warrior Tribe, which is the gym that Khabib Nurmagomedov settled with when he came to the States, and then he moved to AKA. But you've seen Alexander Yakovlev out of that gym. You've seen Azamat Murzakanov out of that gym. A lot of Ovs in the last names of folks training at that gym in Fairfield, New Jersey. So an interesting move there for him. But I went down through all of these Yanal Ashmouz fights that you can find out there, and they're very readily available. You go through it, pro turn back in 2017. First three fights as a pro are over in Israel. And then you see those two over with KNO. So his fight against Yona Kohana, I've never seen a more disgusting guillotine choke in my life. That guy picks him up in the air and chokes the lights out of him. So a big win there. He beats Abdallah in the second round. He beat Getasia in the third round. They have that as a second round win. In the fight against Abdallah, he gets beat for pretty much all of that fight. And then he lands a really big shot and knocks him out.
But he does have that power. That's the thing that we do have to, give him credit for. Because he can fall back in these fights, but he carries power late. He has that one-shot ability. Because that's the thing. I don't want us to get overlooked by his technical or deficiencies, I guess.
In his fight against Getasia, he struggles with the takedowns. He struggles with the striking. He struggles with everything. And then that was the one. It was in the third round. Getasia just kind of lets his hands go down just a little bit. Yanal's throwing wild for the fences. Yanal lands one shot with this side, and then he lands this wild overhand left, and Getasia, like a sack of potatoes, hits the ground. And then in Yanal's fight against Ryan Rizko, Rizko's rinse and repeat with the takedowns, beats him in the first round, beats him in the second round, beating him in the third round, and then in the third round, that's where he ends up getting the finish. So you look at that one. I mean, Yanal is a finisher. I know all the wins until the Dennis Hughes fight are by finish. Hughes was taking him down a little bit in the start, and then Ashmouz was able to defend some of those takedowns, work his own striking. Ashmouz was a pretty big favorite at the start of that fight, about a 3-1. He gets the win, but the weirdest part about it is he's going to be a year to the day removed from his last win over at the PFL, and it's weird. You don't see a lot of PFL Challenger Series fighters end up in the UFC. In December, it was late December, was when Ashmouz signed with the UFC, and now he's matched up in this one against Patterson. Ashmouz could clip Patterson, and I don't say that as it could happen, but it probably won't. It could, because Sam Patterson can struggle, just waiting and waiting, and he's susceptible to getting hit. He's gotten hit big and clean in some of these other fights. but he typically tends to struggle with takedown defense, and I don't know if Ashmouz is going to incorporate that offensively in his game. So for me, I do like Sam Patterson, the straight shots to get through, for him to be able to pick his power shots. He does a really good job of landing.
If he does look good, maybe we don't learn a lot just based on where Yanal is in his own career, but I do think Patterson is favored to win this fight for a good reason.
Matt, both of us going with the future. Ian Machado, Gary, no. Macy Barber, no. Sam Patterson.
It's an overused nickname.
Gotta pick a new nickname. Think of the best slam dunk you've ever seen in NBA history.
I've got it.
And times it by a million. Yanal Ashmouz, overhand right, and as Sam Patterson's falling like a tree, hits him with a left hook. And I went back and watched it a couple of times today, but when I put that one on a board with some of the most disgusting UFC knockouts of all time, you think like Gabriel Gonzaga against Krokop, you think Edson Barboza against Terry Edom, or Rich Franklin when he knocked out Nate Corey and just absolutely corked him.
The Chuck Liddell one's bad,
and
too.
He went cold. So for Yanal Ashmouz, disgusting knockout win over Sam Patterson, the Englishman. And now all of a sudden, Yanal Ashmouz, he's all the hotness. And for Chris Duncan, he's a really weird fighter to be in the UFC. He's 30 years old. He fought twice on Contender Series. First fight, competitive against one Slava Borshev until he gets knocked out. And then his next time out, UFC credits Charlie Campbell with 0 knockdowns. I credit Charlie Campbell with 3 knockdowns. And then Chris Duncan rallies back, knocks out Charlie Campbell. He goes up and fights Omar Morales, who switched gyms. Decided, you know what? I don't need to be MMA Masters anymore. It's KO Zone and it's the Goat Shed. There's a fighter on this card that did the exact same thing in Daniel Marcos. But for Chris Duncan, puts on the wrestling shoes, struggles in some of the striking exchanges, and wins a controversial split decision.
What I will say about Duncan, though, is go back to the Slava fight. We did see a lot more of the wrestling in that matchup, too, and that's the thing. When Duncan is firing on all cylinders, he's not just the guy who is very right-hand heavy, and that's the thing about Duncan. On his second Contender Series matchup against Campbell, that's one of the great one-round fights of all time. It truly is. He gets cracked by some massive shots. Whether they're knockdowns or not, the man is hurt very, very badly, but the result he was able to show by ultimately landing that right hand, it was insane, because he gets hurt, kind of gets knocked down, whatever you want to call it.
It's a Raggedy Andy.
Exactly. Goes down, gets up, and the next punch that man throws knocks out his opponent. So for Duncan, when everything is working, he does have very good power. He has shown the ability to knock out opponents. I do like his wrestling, not at the level of a Khabib or a Michael Chandler, but the fact that he is able to work it in and do it at such a high work rate as well is a really impressive thing. And for Yanal Ashmouz, before we get too carried away with the positives, he's a guy who was taking it down quite a bit on his way up to the UFC, and I'm going to be the first one to admit it. I was wrong about Yanal Ashmouz. I thought Sam Patterson was going to win that fight, and I felt quite strongly that he was going to win that matchup. But what I loved about Yanal in that matchup was his ability to close the distance with his feet. He can go from across the cage to in your face in half a second, like he's some kind of a wide receiver running a 4-2. So for Ashmouz, I was very wrong about him on his way into the UFC, but what he was able to show to me in that Sam Patterson fight is very easy to at least eliminate some of the negatives I had.
Well, there was a reason why I wanted to stop you there. Because you talk about Chris Duncan wrestling, training at American Top Team, living in the dorms, like Greg Hardy. Remember when that experience happened? But if you look at it for Chris Duncan, living in the dorms, training with some of the better fighters there, and he's got pictures with Dustin Poirier. He's training with Johnny Eblen, wrestler. How about Yaroslav Amosov, wrestler?
Just what a stable to train with.
Yeah, good to see that for Chris Duncan coming into this fight. For Ashmouz, still out of K Dojo, Warrior Tribe, the old Khabib gym. But I mean, for Ashmouz, if the wrestling was good, it was good in his fights. If it was bad, it was bad. And then he had to come back with his hands. And that's the thing that you have to worry about with a guy like Yanal Ashmouz. He's no Trevor Peake. No. He's got it as the fights go on. So, Matt, the odds in this one, they are relatively close. It is about a pick'em. We have a look at the fan vote on Tapology. Matt, the fans are wild. I'm going to say over under 80% Yanal Ashmouz.
I think they'll be under that.
I think they're going to be under?
Slightly.
791 total votes, 76% Ashmouz, 82% by knockout. For the 24% that have Duncan, 55% by decision, 34% by knockout. So who do you have in the fight?
So with this fight, I kind of got to go back to what I say this often. How big is the market correction based off their last performance?
There's a lot of those on this card.
Oh, 100%. But for Ashmouz, you can easily get caught up in his ability to close that distance, laying those power hooks. And I am going to pick Yanal. I just don't want people to think I'm only picking him because he looks so good in his last matchup. Duncan's been clipped, and you brought it up. Omar Morales isn't the biggest power puncher by any means, but he's a good technical striker. And when he was able to start to hit Duncan, Duncan was uncomfortable might be a stretch too far, but he didn't really like what was coming back his way. And if Ashmouz can defend some of those initial takedowns and make him really respect his power on the feet, I think Yanal is that much better in his own striking, and that's why I have him in the matchup.
Yanal Ashmouz, 2023's, 2022's Terrence McKinney. Kid's on a roll, and people expect big things out of him. Cross-training at not just the K-Dojo Warrior Tribe, but Tiger Schulman's for this one as well. He mentioned that in an interview with the All-Star MMA's, JHK MMA. Ever so slightly, I'll go with Yanal Ashmouz, but again, if you go back and watch those fights on his way up into the UFC, the wrestling was a little bit of an issue, and Scotland's own Duncan can put those wrestling shoes on. So a tricky fight if you're trying to make a pick on it. Both of us going with Israel's Yanal Ashmouz to get the win. Some big-time fights on this card, including a co-main event between Molly McCann and Yulia Stolyarenko. You are not going to want to miss it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, so we always say, let's get into it.